Okay, so why is Africa so poor? The reason this is a subject is because I hear a lot of people say if Africa had never been colonized, we would be much better off, or we hate those colonizers so much. You know, you'll find out that most of these people who say this are uneducated, um, non intellectual, and how can I put it? Have zero accountability. It's like most people who say those type of things, they have a victimhood ideology. They always have to point the finger at somebody. It's never their fault. They can never have any accountability. The finger must always be pointed at somebody else. And when the question is asked, why is Africa so poor? They always want to point their finger at the white man. They want to point their finger at the Europeans. But if you take a deep dive into European colonization of Africa and what they did for Africa, and was Africa better off during colonization or after colonization, you'll find out Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa in particular, was at its peak during European colonization. After decolonization, after the Europeans left, Africa was poor. Africa went downhill. Their heydays, their peak was during colonization. I mean, okay, let's talk about Africa. Like Africa before colonization, it was technologically it was backwards. They didn't have the wheel, they didn't have to plow, they didn't have really didn't have any writing system outside of Ethiopia. Well, we're really talking about sub-Saharan Africa. The British, the French, the Spanish, Germans, all of them when they came in there, they brought administrative techniques, they brought education and infrastructural developments like railroad, vehicles, roads ready for vehicles, all of that. They helped the process of industrialization at the expense of slave labor, yes. Before you go on and talk about slave labor, it was actually the British who put an end to slavery, and I made a previous video about that. Africa was involved in enslaving each other long before Europeans ever came to Africa or sub Saharan Africa, any part of it. They were already fully indulged in the society of slave labor before the Europeans came. And it was actually the Europeans who had to force them to stop enslaving each other. And if you don't believe me, I'll leave a link to the video below, or I'll put it at the end of this video. And to be honest, the Europeans did way more for Africans than the Arabs did. Oh, who's the Arabs? Oh, yeah. The Arabs were one of the major peoples who colonized Africa before the Europeans came. The European, excuse me, the Arab slave trade throughout Africa, known as the Zanzibarian slave trade and the Saharan slave trade, they traded more slaves than the Atlantic slave trade could ever even any number you could even possibly estimate or think of, and it lasted longer. So before the Europeans even came to Africa, they were getting their asses colonized, whooped, and enslaved by Arabs, and the Arabs didn't do anything for Africa. They didn't bring any technological advances. They didn't add anything to it. They were just exporting slaves and castrating them like dogs. So before you want to point the finger so quickly at the Europeans, the Arabs enslaved you longer, enslaved more of you, and were 10 times made cruel. Excuse me, 10 times more cruel. They were castrating Africans like dogs before the Europeans came and kicked them out. So you can thank them for that. So most of the African countries were independent by 1965. But so during colonization, a whole generation of African political and business leaders went to Europe, UK, France, Belgium, Italy, the USA for education, from more advanced economies. And, you would think that they would get this education and they would come back home and teach their people and build their country up. But no, they didn't do that. Why? Because they were greedy, they were corrupt. Instead of going back home to contribute to national development, they became greedy. Instead of economic development for the country, they strove for self development, like Thomas Sowell said. And it's not the European colonists' fault that they gave these people a Western education and they came back and those leaders came back and were corrupt and didn't want to help their country. I mean, from what I hear, a lot of those leaders they sell out to European countries. They'll Most of them won't even live. The leaders won't even live in Africa. They'll be living somewhere in Italy, driving expensive cars, and the corruption in Africa is you have your leaders to blame. So yeah, Africa isn't poor because of colonization, but it's poor because of failure to manage resources. The British and French came in there with infrastructure, advancing in technology, building roads. But in all actuality, Britain gained nothing from establishing colonies in Africa. And not in Britain, the French, all of them. It's partly of why when they finally started to go to war with some of the other indigenous Africans who wanted them out, it wasn't much of a they didn't put up much of a fight because they weren't really gaining anything. Most of those colonies was a total loss for them. So what was the point in them even staying there? But after they left, they stayed trading partners. And so after the Europeans left, Africa was at its heyday during colonization. Today, Africa is the poorest continent in the world as far as GDP. No, there's no major resource that Africa exports to the rest of the world that they couldn't survive without. No, I'm sorry, it's not oil. The US, we actually get most of our oil from Canada. There's no major resource in Africa that the US or anyone or any other global power needs. There are natural resources that Africa exports, but all those countries will can self-sustain without Africa. So yeah, Africa has a negative growth in output per capita. So all of the rail, everything that Africa has, Africa is technologically behind a lot of countries today as far as everything. But if it wasn't for colonization, they would be even further behind. So, what sort of substantial major economic invention has Africa contribute to the world or to themselves without the help of Europeans during colonization? And the answer is nothing. Unfortunately, the country of Africa has not produced anything major. So, everything that most people in Africa take for granted vehicles, roadways, internet, weapons, running water, you name it are things that they got during the times of colonization that the Europeans brought and introduced to them. If it wasn't for colonization, Africa would probably still be in the Stone Age, still throwing sticks and spears at themselves, still enslaving each other and tribal warfare. Well, tribal warfare is still going on today, but you get the picture. And I'm not trying to bash anybody, but this is just being honest. I seriously dislike when people point the finger at Europeans and say, and just talk about how Africa would have been so much better without colonization. No, would have been even worse than they already are without colonization. They dropped the ball. Colonization was supposed to put them on par with other global economic powers, but they dropped it. They could not manage their resources and end up being one of the poorest continents in the world and constantly needing imports and pretty much begging for food and whatever from other countries. And so when people want to talk about colonization and imperialism, colonization isn't necessarily a bad thing. It may be a bad thing for those people who have to live through it, but the end goal is prosperous. Why do I say something like that? Okay, in order for a country to make advancements and stay on par with other global powers, you have to interact and trade with other nations. If you don't, if you landlock yourself and isolate yourself and fortify yourself, somebody's going to end up knocking on your door or knocking down your walls and with all sorts of advanced weaponry and just enslaving and killing you. Look at what happened with China when they fortified themselves. Even with Japan in World War II, we had to they sort of fortified themselves. We had to force them to open up trade, and since they did open up trade with other countries, look how technologically advanced Japan is now. The trend with colonization and countries moving up in technological advances and being on par, it goes hand in hand. All of the civilizations from the Mediterranean, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and all of that, they were at the peak of all. They were at the peak of all the major economies in the world because they were trading with each other. They're all right there next to each other, right across the sea from each other, trading. Think about how backwards Britain was before the Romans conquered Britain. Think about how backwards Scots were before Britain conquered them, and so on. So unfortunately, that's just how it goes. Some of the poor, as Thomas Sowell says, some of the poorest places in the world today are places where imperialists never touched. Why is that? Some of the poorest places in the world are the places where imperialists never touched. Everywhere global powers are imperialists touch and colonize, most of those places end up profiting. Most of those places end up advancing. So contact with foreign nations is what brings advancement. This is just the way that the world works. So if you aren't striving in technological advances, education, and writing systems and trades and everything, then you're going to be left behind and you're going to get bullied. Unfortunately, human nature is to conquer. You either conquer or get conquered. And this is what human nature has showed throughout all of recorded history. This is just human biology. You conquer or you get conquered. There is no fortifying yourself and hoping no one will bother you. No, that's not how the world works. If you aren't constantly trying to create things to make yourself better than the next person, then you will get bullied. You will get enslaved, conquered, or whatever you want to say. This is just what history has showed. European colonization of Africa, during that time, Africa was at its peak. And after they left, Africa went downhill and became one of the poorest continents in the world. And let's not tell fake stories and imagine that before the colonists came, we were all in Africa. We were all living side by side, holding hands, singing "Kumbaya." That's a damn lie. That's a damn lie. Africans were enslaving each other and fighting against each other for hundreds and thousands of years before Europeans even came there. You had to, in was now Nigeria, you had the Fulanis were slaughtering the other groups to the south. You had the Yorubas fighting the Asante and all sorts of stuff. And even in South Africa, like, who do you think built all that infrastructure in South Africa? Everything that they export, who do you think built that? Without the Europeans, without Europe, China, Russia, or any other outside global power, Africa is nothing. People want to complain, oh, everybody is draining Africa of natural resources. Well, those other places are the ones who found those natural resources. Unfortunately, people in Africa didn't have the education to dig up that stuff or know what type of resources they were walking on. So it wouldn't even have been put to use. So that's that. So colonization is might be a bad thing for the people at that time and what they have to go through, but for the ancestors of those people who go through it in the long run, they profit from it.